Hey guys, welcome back to another late night dive into history's darker corners. It's your host here, and tonight we're starting with something a little heavier than usual. I see some of you already in the chat. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm recording this at about 2 a.m. with just my desk lamp on, and there's something about these quiet hours that makes these stories hit different. You know, before we jump in, maybe dim the lights wherever you are. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum. If you've got one, pour yourself something to drink. Tea, coffee, maybe something stronger, if that's your vibe. We're about to spend the next while together, exploring what it was really like to be one of the millions of forgotten souls who built the Roman Empire from the bottom up. And look, I know some of you are new here, some are regulars. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us for these journeys. If you genuinely enjoy what we do here, feel free to like and subscribe. But honestly, only if this is your kind of content. No pressure. I'd rather have a smaller group of people who really want to be here than thousands who clicked by accident. The truth is, what we're about to explore isn't pretty. It's not the Hollywood version, with noble gladiators and kind masters. It's the reality of Roman slavery was brutal, complex, and surprisingly relevant to understanding how civilizations really work. So settle in, take a breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Rome, but you're not a citizen. You're not even considered fully human. You're property, and your day is about to begin. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's not just body odor. Though packed into this windowless room with 20 other bodies, that's certainly part of it. It's the smell of fierce sweat, unwashed wounds, and that particular stench of hopelessness that seems to seep into the very walls. You're lying on bare stone, maybe some moldy straw, if you're lucky, and your body aches in places you didn't know could hurt. A bell clangs somewhere above you. Still dark outside, probably around the 10th hour of night, what we'd call 4 a.m. But time doesn't belong to you anymore. Nothing does, not even your name. You're called poor if you're young, service if you're male, ancilla if you're female. Just generic terms for thing that works. The overseer, another slave, but one who's learned that brutality earns privileges, kicks the door open. He's carrying a stick, because of course he is. Violence is the universal language here, more reliable than Latin or Greek or whatever tongue you were ripped away from. Maybe you're fresh off the boat from Germania, still thinking this is temporary. Maybe you were born here, and this is the only life you've ever known. Either way, that stick speaks clearly. Move now, or bleed. You stumble to your feet, trying not to step on the others. Some don't get up. They're either dead or close enough that it doesn't matter. The overseer will deal with them later, probably drag them out and dump them in the mass grave outside the city walls. No funeral rites, no dignity, just organic waste disposal. Roman efficiency at its finest. Here's the kicker. You might have been someone important last week. Maybe you were a merchant whose business failed, sold yourself to pay debts. Maybe you were a soldier on the wrong side of the latest conquest. Hell, maybe you were just walking down the wrong road when slavers decided you looked profitable. The Romans had this amazing ability to look at a human being and see only denarii. You shuffle out into the courtyard with the others. It's cold, but you won't get a cloak unless your work requires you to be seen by important people. Appearance only matters if it reflects on your owner. You might be working in the same tunic for months until it literally falls apart, and when it does, you'll be punished for not taking better care of your master's property. The morning inspection is its own special hell. Stand in line, eyes down, never, ever make eye contact unless ordered. The villicus, the slave manager, walks the line. He's checking for illness, injury, pregnancy if you're female, not out of concern for your well-being, mind you. A sick slave can't work. An injured slave is worth less at market. A pregnant slave, well, That's complicated. Could be valuable. Free baby slave in 9 months. Could be a problem if the father is someone important. You learn quickly that everything about your body is now a financial calculation. Too skinny. You're not getting enough nutrition to work efficiently. Might get an extra handful of barley. Too fat. You're stealing food. Expect a beating. That cough that's been getting worse. Better hide it, because sick slaves sometimes just disappear. And here's something they don't show in the movies. The psychological warfare starts immediately. You're not allowed to speak unless spoken to. You can't use the latrine without permission. You eat when they say, sleep when they say, breathe when they say. It's like the world's worst boot camp, except it never ends, and the drill sergeant literally owns you. The worst part, some of your fellow slaves have completely bought into the system. They'll report you for the smallest infraction, hoping to earn favor. They'll work themselves to death, trying to prove they're valuable. Stockholm Syndrome isn't a modern invention. The Romans just called it being a good slave. But you're learning the rules now. Keep your head down. Work hard enough to avoid the whip, but not so hard you make others look bad. Never trust anyone completely. Hide any skills you have. Being too valuable in one area means you'll never be sold to a potentially better situation. And always, always remember that to them, you're not a person temporarily experiencing slavery. You're a tool that happens to talk. The sun's coming up now. In a few minutes, you'll be marched to whatever labor awaits. Veals, mines, kitchens, brothels. Dirt for now. In this brief moment, between the bell and the work, you allow yourself the only rebellion available. You remember your name, your real name. They can own your body, but that small silent act of defiance, that's yours, at least until the overseer's stick reminds you otherwise. So, you've survived your first few weeks, maybe months, but now your owner's decided you're not worth keeping. Maybe his business is struggling, maybe you're too much trouble, or maybe he just saw a newer model he likes better. Whatever the reason, you're about to experience one of Rome's most sophisticated and horrifying institutions, the slave market. They clean you up first, which should be your first red flag. After months of neglect, suddenly they care about your appearance. They oil your skin to make you look healthy, force you to exercise to show you're strong. If you've got wounds, they cover them with white lead. Yeah, the poisonous stuff. If you're young and remotely attractive, God's help you, they might even give you wine to make your cheeks flush. You're being prepared like a used chariot for sale, except chariots don't have to stand there and smile. The main markets in Rome are near the Forum, but every major city has one. Picture a cross between a livestock auction and the world's most degrading job fair. You're standing on a raised platform called a cataster, completely naked, because buyers want to see exactly what they're purchasing. There's a titulus around your neck, a sign listing your qualities like a menu. Greek, educated, good with numbers. Germanic, strong back, no skills. Syrian girl, age 14, intact. Yeah, let that last one sink in. The buyers circle like vultures, and they're allowed to do whatever they want to inspect the merchandise. They check your teeth like you're a horse. They squeeze your muscles, prod your stomach, examine every inch of you, while discussing your defects loud enough for everyone to hear. This one's too old. Look at those scars. He's a runner. She's pretty but probably diseased. And here's where it gets really dark. You're required to participate in your own sale. The manguns, the slave dealers, have trained you to show your best qualities. Can you read? They'll shove a scroll in your hands. Strong, pick up those weights. Skilled at massage, start demonstrating on another slave. It's like performing your own degradation for an audience that sees you as an investment opportunity. The pricing hierarchy is fascinating in its cruelty. At the top, young, educated Greeks who can tutor rich kids. They might go for 2,000 denarii or more. That's like buying a luxury car in today's money. skilled craftsmen, good-looking personal attendants. They're in the middle tier. The bottom, agricultural workers, mine slaves, anyone over 40, you might sell for less than a good donkey. But here's the truly sick part. Specialty markets. There's one for sex slaves where I won't even describe what happens during the inspection. There's one for children, marketed to wealthy families who want to raise the perfect servant from scratch. There's even a market for disabled slaves. Missing a limb, you'll make a great beggar for someone's street corner revenue scheme. The dealers are master manipulators. They'll lie about your origin, your skills, your age. That Spanish virgin might be a Gallic widow. That trained accountant might barely know numbers. But once the sale's final, buyer beware. The Romans actually had lemon laws for slaves. You could return defective merchandise within 6 months. Defective meaning diseased, not suffering from the trauma of being sold like cattle. Sometimes families are sold together, but usually not. Watch a mother screaming as her child goes to one buyer, she to another, and the father to a third. The Romans found that separated slaves were more dependent on their new masters, less likely to run. Plus, package deals cut into profits. The worst position, being left unsold at the end of the day. It means you're worthless, and worthless slaves don't get fed much. You'll be dragged to smaller, seedier markets. Each failure to sell drops your price, and your chances of survival. Eventually, you'll be bought in bulk by someone needing bodies for the mines, or worse. The transaction itself is bizarrely formal. Bills of sale, warranties, receipts, all properly documented. The Romans kept better records of slave purchases than some companies today keep of their employees. You stand there naked while men in togas haggle over your price like you're a piece of furniture, and once that money changes hands, you follow your new owner to whatever fresh hell awaits, knowing you might be back on this platform in a month, a year, whenever they tire of you. The cycle continues, and the market always has fresh stock. Welcome to commerce Roman style. Alright, so you've been sold, but here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean completely fucked up. Your fate isn't just about who bought you, it's about what category of slave you've become. The Romans had this whole complex hierarchy of human property, and where you landed on that ladder determined whether you'd live to 30 or die next week. Let's start with the lucky ones. Mice household slaves in rich urban homes. If you're educated, speak Greek, maybe know some mathematics or literature, you might become a pedagogus, teaching the master's kids. It's indoor work, decent food, and the children might even grow fond of you. Of course, when they grow up, that same kid you raised might sell you without blinking, but hey, at least you're not in the mines. Personal attendants had it relatively cushy too. You're dressing your master, managing their schedule, maybe even handling their correspondence. Some slaves became so trusted they basically ran entire households. The famous architect Cicero had a slave named Tiro, who was basically his personal assistant, confidant, and eventually freed friend. But for every Tiro, there were thousands who spent their lives literally wiping their master's ass, and I mean that literally. Romans had communal toilet sponges, and guess who had to clean them? Now, if you're beautiful or handsome, gods help you, you might become a concubinus, or concubinus, a sex slave. And before anyone romanticizes this, let me be clear, this was systematic rape, full stop. Men, women, children. Romans saw sexual access to slaves as completely normal. Your master's friends visiting, your entertainment. Master's wife feeling vindictive. She might order you to service the stable hands as punishment. The psychological damage was so severe that many killed themselves rather than endure it. But at least household slaves were seen. Agricultural slaves, you're basically livestock with thumbs, chained in groups of 10, working fields from dawn to dusk, sleeping in barracks that make prison cells look luxurious. Life expectancy, maybe 5 years if you're strong. The overseer's whip is your alarm clock, dinner bell and lullaby.
You'll die in those fields, probably from exhaustion or untreated injury, and be replaced the next day. Think that's bad? Let me tell you about the mines. If you're sentenced to the silver mines in Spain, or the quarries in Egypt, you've basically received a death sentence with extra steps, crawling through tunnels barely big enough for a child, breathing toxic fumes, hauling rocks until your body literally breaks. Most lasted 6 months. The Romans considered it cost-effective. Why feed a slave for years when you can work them to death quickly and buy fresh ones? But here's where it gets weird. Some slaves had power. Imperial slaves, working in the emperor's household, could become incredibly influential. They managed finances, ran government departments, controlled access to the emperor himself. Claudius's secretary Narcissus was technically a slave, but had more real power than most senators. These guys had slaves of their own, lived in luxury, and sometimes forgot they were property until someone reminded them with extreme prejudice. Gladiators occupy this bizarre middle ground. Yes, they're slaves, but they're also celebrities, trained to kill, fed well to maintain muscle, given medical care because they're expensive investments. Women literally threw themselves at famous gladiators, but that fame came with knowing that any day, you might die for entertainment. And even if you survived and won your freedom, you were forever marked as infamia, legally inferior, socially outcast. Then there are the specialized slaves that show just how twisted Roman society was. Nomenclators memorized names and faces so their master could fake personal connections. Delicia were child slaves kept as pets, and I use that term deliberately. They were dressed up, played with and discarded when they grew too old. Capsari just carried their master's towels to the baths. Imagine your entire existence being towel holder. The entertainment slaves had their own hierarchy. Musicians, dancers, actors, they performed at parties and theaters. If you were talented, you might live comfortably. If not, you'd end up in the lower tier entertainment. Prostitution, exotic dancing, or those horrifying dinner parties where slaves were tortured for guest amusement. Here's the darkest truth. Your category could change instantly. That trusted household position, one bad day, one perceived slight, and you're in the mines. That gladiator fame, one lost fight, and you're dog food. The only constant was the absolute power others had over your life. The Romans created a system where human beings were sorted like tools in a workshop. Hammer for building, saw for cutting, disposable rag for cleaning up the mess, and they convinced themselves this was natural, necessary, the foundation of civilization itself. Spoiler alert, it wasn't.
So you've been categorized, processed, and assigned. Now comes the grind. Literally surviving day to day in a system designed to extract maximum value from your body while keeping you just functional enough to work. Let's walk through what 24 hours looks like when you're property. Your day starts before sunrise always. Doesn't matter if you're a house slave or field worker. Romans believed slaves who slept too much got lazy. You're getting maybe 4 hours of sleep on a good night, usually on the floor or a straw mat if you're lucky. Household slaves might have a corner in the kitchen near the dying embers of the cooking fire. Field slaves are packed into ergastula, basically barracks that lock from the outside. First thing, you don't get breakfast. You get assigned morning tasks on an empty stomach because fed slaves might have energy to think, and thinking is dangerous. House slaves are already hauling water, starting fires, preparing their master's morning routine. Field slaves are marching to wherever they'll spend the next 12 hours breaking their backs. Food, when it comes, is calculated to keep you alive and nothing more. Your basic ration is about a pound of bread daily, some olives, maybe some garum, that fermented fish sauce Romans loved, if the master's feeling generous. Meat, maybe during religious festivals when they sacrifice animals and throw you the parts they don't want. You learn to eat everything Nadapol cores from the master's table, grain that fell during transport, anything that won't be missed. But here's where human ingenuity kicks in. Slaves developed entire underground economies. You're stealing food, obviously, a handful of grain here, scraps from dinner preparation there. Kitchen slaves had it best, skimming just enough to avoid notice. Field slaves learned which plants were edible, caught rats and snakes. Everyone traded that extra bread for help with your work quota, sexual favors for meat, information for wine. The work itself varies, but the exhaustion doesn't. Household slaves might seem to have it easier, cleaning, cooking, attending to the family, but you're on call 24/7. Master can't sleep. You're up fanning him. Mistress wants a midnight snack. Get cooking. Their kid has a nightmare. Guess who's singing lullabies until dawn? And gods forbid you look tired the next day. Field slaves have a different torture. Quotas. You must plow X amount, harvest Y bushels, dig Z ditches. Don't meet quota. That's a beating. Meet it too easily. Quota goes up tomorrow. The overseers, usually slaves themselves, are trapped in the same system. They beat you because if they don't, they get beaten. It's brutality all the way down. Punishments are creative and constant. The whip is just the starting point. There's the fur commercial wooden yoke locked around your neck that you wear for days. Branding for runaways. Hot iron to the face, so everyone knows you can't be trusted. And for serious offenses, crucifixion wasn't just for rebels. Kill another slave. Try to poison your master. Get caught with weapons. You're going up on a cross as an example. But humans adapt, and slaves found ways to resist without dying. Work slowdowns that looked like exhaustion. Accidentally breaking expensive tools. Playing dumb when you spoke 4 languages. Faking illness was an art form. Too sick and you're worthless. Might be killed. Just sick enough and you get a day of reduced work. Relationships between slaves were complicated. You'd think shared misery would bond everyone, but the system was designed to prevent that. Rewards for snitching, privileges for being the master's favorite, sexual jealousy when the master preferred one slave over another. But still, people formed friendships, fell in love, created makeshift families. They'd share food, cover for each other, pass along survival tips to newcomers. The nights brought their own challenges. In the few hours of free time, you're mending your one tunic, tending wounds that can't be shown, maybe participating in religious rites to gods who seem to have abandoned you. Some slaves practice mystery cults that promise better afterlives. Mithraism, Christianity, anything that suggested suffering had meaning. Sleep, when it finally comes, is escape. But even dreams weren't safe. Wake up speaking your native language, crying out a free name, and someone might report you as a flight risk. So you learn to control even your unconscious hours, pushing down memories of freedom so deep that eventually, some slaves forgot they ever had them. Tomorrow, same bell, same exhaustion, same struggle to stay human in a system designed to make you equipment. Welcome to the daily grind. Roman style. Now let's talk about what all this does to your mind, because the physical brutality is only half the story. The Romans didn't just want your body, they needed to break your spirit so completely that you'd police yourself, and they were frighteningly good at it. First thing that happens, you lose your name. Not metaphorically, literally. You're given a new one, usually something generic or mocking. Felix, lucky for someone who clearly isn't. Hilarious, cheerful for the guy who tried to kill himself twice. It's psychological warfare at its most basic. Erase who you were, replace it with what they want you to be. The isolation hits different than you'd expect. You're surrounded by people but can't trust anyone. That fellow slave who seems friendly might be angling for overseer position by reporting conversations. Share your escape plan with the wrong person, and you're dead by morning. So you learn to be alone in a crowd, performing compliance while your real thoughts stay locked away. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't invented in 1973. The Romans just perfected it 2,000 years early. Some slaves became genuinely devoted to their masters, especially those raised in captivity. When your entire world is one household,
when the master's approval means food, and the mistress's smile means no beating today. Your brain rewires itself for survival. You start believing you're lucky. At least I'm not in the mines. My master only beats me when I deserve it. Defeat me, I owe them loyalty. The generational damage is what really gets me. Children born into slavery don't know freedom exists. They grow up thinking this is natural, that some people are just born to serve. These kids often became the most reliable slaves. No memories of freedom to cause trouble. The Romans knew this. Vernay houseborn slaves were valued specifically because their spirits came pre-broken. But here's the mindfuck. Sometimes hope was worse than despair. The possibility of manumission, freedom, was dangled like a carrot. Serve faithfully for 20 years, and maybe, if you just work harder, when the master dies, his will might. This hope could keep you compliant for decades, always believing freedom was just around the corner. Most died waiting. The coping mechanisms were as varied as the slaves themselves. Some retreated entirely into themselves, becoming empty shells that followed orders. Others developed elaborate fantasy lives. Many turned to alcohol when they could steal it, or opium if they worked near medicines. Self-harm was epidemic. Not always suicide attempts, but ways to feel something you controlled. Religion became huge because it offered what reality couldn't: justice, meaning, eventual reward. Mystery cults spread through slave populations like wildfire. Christianity's message, that the last would be first, that resonated hard with people who were legally last. The cult of Mithras promised cosmic justice. Even traditional gods got reinterpreted. Maybe Jupiter would strike down the masters eventually. The trauma bonding between slaves created its own psychological complexities. You'd form intense friendships fast because anyone could disappear tomorrow, but you'd also betray those friends to survive. The guilt from these betrayals lasted forever, another weight on already crushed spirits. Some slaves developed what we'd now recognize as dissociative disorders, literally checking out mentally during abuse. Others became hypervigilant, reading every micro-expression on their master's face to avoid violence. Many developed elaborate rituals around their few possessions or small freedoms, trying to maintain some sense of control. The sickest part, the system was designed to make slaves participate in their own oppression. Overseers were slaves. The person branding runaways was a slave. The woman preparing other women for the sex markets was a slave. You survived by becoming complicit, and that complicity ate at whatever humanity you had left. Recovery from this, even after manumission, was nearly impossible. Freed slaves often couldn't sleep without permission, couldn't eat without guilt, couldn't make decisions after decades of having every choice made for them. The physical chains came off, but the mental ones, those lasted generations. The Romans created a system that didn't just use people, it hollowed them out, rebuilt them as tools, and convinced them to maintain their own oppression. It was psychological warfare perfected through centuries of practice, and its echoes lasted long after Rome fell.
So let's talk about the light at the end of the tunnel. Except for most slaves, that light was an oncoming chariot. Manumission, the formal freeing of slaves, was real but rarer than the Romans wanted you to believe. They turned it into this brilliant psychological torture device, hope that kept you compliant, but statistically unlikely to pay off. The most common path to freedom was through the will of a dead master. Romans loved looking generous in death. Costs them nothing, makes them seem noble, and their heirs get to keep the young valuable slaves, while freeing the old ones who can't work much anyway. You'd spend decades serving faithfully, praying your master dies before you do, only to find out the will frees 3 out of 50 household slaves. Guess who didn't make the cut? Then there's manumission by purchase, the cruelest joke of all. Slaves could technically own property peculium, usually small tips or gifts. Save every copper for 30 years, and maybe you could buy yourself. But here's the catch. Your master sets your price, and surprise, you're always worth more than you've saved. Plus, they could confiscate your savings anytime, because legally, A slave's property belongs to the master. It's like trying to buy your way out of prison with monopoly money. The warden can take whenever he wants. Living masters might free slaves for various reasons. Almost none altruistic. Aging mistress frees her hairdresser after 40 years of service. That's not kindness. That's dumping a senior citizen who can't hold scissors steady anymore. Merchant frees his accountant, probably wants him to run a business that legally the master still controls. Sexual slaves freed by guilty masters, usually pregnant with the master's child. And Roman law gets complicated about slave-born children of citizens. The state occasionally freed slaves en masse, but only during extreme crises. Need bodies for the army, because Hannibal's knocking at the gates. Congratulations, you're free. Here's a sword. Try not to die immediately. These emergency freedmen were cannon fodder with citizenship papers, but here's what they don't tell you about manumission. It wasn't really freedom. You became a libetous freedman, forever tied to your former master as a client. You owed them respect, service, often days of unpaid labor annually. Disrespect your patron. Back to slavery. Try to leave town without permission. Back to slavery. Your kids might be full citizens, but you're just slavery light. The ceremony itself was humiliating. The master would spin you around, slap you seriously, and declare you free. You'd wear a special cap pileus that screamed former slave to everyone. Your name forever included your master's, like being branded even after the chains come off. Marcus's former slave Tiro becomes Marcus Tullius Tiro, never just Tiro. On the psychological damage of freedom could be worse than slavery. Imagine spending 40 years asking permission to eat, sleep, then suddenly you're supposed to make decisions. Freedmen often stayed in their master's household, doing the same work for tiny wages, because the outside world was terrifying after decades of captivity. The numbers tell the real story. Maybe 5% of slaves ever saw manumission. Most died in bondage, their children born into it, creating an endless cycle. Freedom wasn't a goal. It was a control mechanism, a false promise that kept millions compliant, while benefiting the tiny few who proved useful enough to discard generously. The path to freedom, for most it led straight to an unmarked grave. Alright, we need to talk about the stuff that even HBO's Rome wouldn't touch. The everyday horrors that were so normalized Romans didn't even consider them worth mentioning in their histories. Trigger warning doesn't even cover it. Nice, this is the abyss staring back. Sexual violence wasn't a crime against slaves. It was a property right. Your master, his friends, his teenage sons learning to be men. Any citizen who paid your owner, all had access. Children weren't exempt. The Romans had specific terms for child sex slaves, delicia, per delicatus, because it was that common. The famous poet Martial wrote casual jokes about beating his child slave for refusing sex. That's not hidden history. That's celebrated literature. Speaking of children, let's destroy the myth of Roman childhood innocence. Slave children worked from the moment they could walk. 4-year-olds holding parasols, 6-year-olds in mines, and Vernet-spawn slaves were often the master's own children by slave women, raised as slaves, alongside their half-siblings who were citizens. Imagine serving dinner to your brother, who can legally sell you. Medical experimentation, absolutely rampant. Galen, the famous physician, perfected surgical techniques on living slaves. Because dissecting citizens was illegal, need to practice removing cataracts. Here's a slave. Want to test if this poison is lethal? Slave. Roman medical advancement was literally built on unwilling human experimentation that would make Nazi doctors blush. Crucifixion gets all the press, but Romans had creative ways to kill slaves that Hollywood won't touch. Damnatio ad bestias.
thrown to wild animals for entertainment, burning alive for arson, buried alive for killing a master. And here's the fucked up part. If a slave killed their master, all the slaves in the household were executed. Didn't matter if you were asleep 3 rooms away. 1 slave snaps, 50 die. It encouraged slaves to police each other through terror. The mass graves tell stories historians gloss over. Archaeologists find pits with hundreds of bodies. Slaves worked to death and dumped like garbage. No markers, no records, just bone piles that were once people. Conservative estimates say 30 to 40% of Italy was enslaved. That's millions of unmarked graves, millions of stories we'll never know. But here's the darkest truth of all. It worked. Rome built the greatest empire in Western history on this suffering. Every aqueduct, every road, every beautiful statue was made possible by human misery on an industrial scale. And they convinced themselves, and history, that this was civilization. When people romanticize Rome, remember this: their glory was built on foundations of bone mortared with blood, decorated with the tears of millions, whose names we'll never know. And if we're back, take a breath. I know that was heavy. It's 3 a.m. now for some of you. Thanks for staying with me through that journey. Look, I share these stories not to depress you but because they matter. When we really understand how humans treated other humans, not as ancient history, but as real people who felt everything we feel, it changes how we see our own world. Those slaves had dreams, inside jokes, favorite foods, people they loved. They were us, just born in the wrong time and place. The resilience though, that's what gets me every time. Despite everything, they found ways to stay human. They loved, they laughed when they could, they protected each other. The human spirit is harder to break than any empire ever realized. Anyway, I'll let you get back to your night. Maybe hug someone you care about. Appreciate that you chose what to eat today, when to sleep, who to love. Basic freedoms that millions never had. Thanks for joining me in the dark tonight, friends. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember the forgotten. Peace out.